working?
That's working.
Good.
You can hear me?
Okay. So today we're speaking of, or this month, grace and presence and power. I'm going to talk about grace. And Angie talked about this a little last time, that divine grace, of course, was an idea that was part of the concepts of early Christianity, of Orthodox Christianity, if you will. And its concept, though, was that you didn't get salvation because you earned it. In other words, you couldn't do a lot of good things and say, okay, I've racked up enough good things, now I've earned the right to go to heaven. And you didn't get it by a contract with God. You know, you couldn't say, hey, I'll go off and do these things for you if I get into heaven. But rather, it was the grace of God. It was very important at that time, at certain times, to understand that concept that you get that salvation strictly because of the choice that God would make. And in fact, it was considered a sin to think you even knew. I've mentioned this before in the trial of Joan of Arc. One of the things they tried to do was to get her to say that because of her special relationship with God, that she knew she was saved. Because if she said that, that would have been a heresy, to know the mind of God. So last time, now here where we're at, last time Angelo and Joanne talked very eloquently about grace, divine grace, but I don't believe that's really what's taught here most of the time. I mean, what we teach primarily is that we control our fate, that if something happened to you, it's because of the negative thoughts you put in mind. And if you want something good, the way that you get that is that you create that in your mind, and it's your thoughts, and it's how you put those thoughts into play that is the determining factor of what's going to happen with your life. And that's not what I'm going to say today. And each month, I actually am surprised that they let me come up and speak, because I don't say the normal things that we teach, and I suspect it's because nobody really listens to me, so it doesn't matter that much. But I believe in divine grace, and I believe that things come to us many times. Not that, I mean, we have a role in this, certainly. Our thoughts, our feelings affect it, but they come to us also through divine grace. And I believe that because I believe in religious science and the science of mind. Now let's think about what those things have in common. Science. Now, science is based on theories, and people often, I've had people talk to me about this before, they get confused about the concept of scientific theories. They think that what scientists do is that they have these theories, they prove them, and then they say, now we know the truth about this. But that's not what science does at all. In science, nothing is ever proven. It may be that theory is accepted as the very best concept we have at the time, but it's not proven as absolute truth. And let me give you an example. For most of the history of mankind, we didn't really have any theory of gravity. If you threw something up, it came down. The stars and planets were thought to be fixed in these spheres around the earth, but there wasn't really a theory dealing with gravity. And then Isaac Newton came up with a theory of gravity. And it was a very, very, very good theory of gravity. I don't see Bill here today, but Bill, of course, is very mechanically minded, and he built and rebuilds, if you will, old cars and things. But if he decided instead in his workplace to build a rocket ship, and he decided to build a rocket ship to go to Mars, that's 150 million miles from here. And he had to figure out, with the Earth spinning and the Earth moving and Mars moving, and it's 150 million miles away, how does he get this rocket ship from here exactly on Mars? He could use Isaac Newton's theories of gravity, and he could do that. Those theories are good. But you know what? If you took out your cell phone and you wanted to locate where you were with your GPS system based on a radio beam coming from a satellite several miles above the Earth, and you used Isaac Newton's theory of gravity, you would be lost because it wouldn't work. It's good. It's not that good. And yet, we use GPS systems all the time. Why? Because some lowly, poorly paid patent clerk, 200 years after Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, came up with another theory, the theory of relativity. And that's what we use in our GPS systems and many other things. And relativity theory has been tested many times and always comes out right. But guess what? There's another theory, quantum theory, about subatomic things. And it's been tested hundreds and thousands of times, and it's always right, except you can't put the two theories together. It doesn't work. So somebody else, maybe one of our children or grandchildren, somebody else is going to come up with a better theory. And that's how science works. Now, what does that have to do with divine grace? Well, about 90 years ago, Holmes wrote Science of Mind. And that's Ernest Holmes, not Sherlock Holmes. So you won't be confused about that. So, if we're going to believe in religious science and be spiritual scientists, do we say, well, Holmes wrote this, so this is what it must be? Just as if when people said, Isaac Newton said this, so this is what it must be. Or, as spiritual scientists, do we need to look at things differently and say, is that the way it actually works? Yeah, it's a good idea. There were brilliant ideas in that book. But is that all of it? Is there more? Do we need to look more? So let's go back to, do we totally determine what happens to us? Stephen talked about his cancer. Did he decide to have cancer? Did Maggie decide to have cancer? Did she decide to have this excruciating pain in her hips? I read about a young woman who was brutally murdered. Did she decide that? Well, I mean, maybe so. Maybe Stephen's unconscious mind decided for him to have cancer, but I don't believe it. I don't think that's a good answer to that, because his unconscious mind creates this beautiful music that we hear. It starts with that unconscious. It doesn't make sense to me that that same consciousness, that same level of consciousness would create that cancer. So what other answers are there? Where Holmes provides part of that. He says there's race consciousness. He says that people all over the world are having these thoughts, and many of them at a very low level of consciousness, and so it's all of those thoughts that affect. And I think that's almost certainly part of that answer. But what about before people were around? I brought that up before. When stars were forming. I mentioned it before. Life All life that we know of depends on carbon. There's only one place carbon is made, and that's inside a star. And you make carbon, in case you ever want to go about making it, by putting two atoms of helium together, except they won't go together. You cannot make them go together, except inside a star, they vibrate at just exactly the right vibration that allows them to overcome the repulsive force and come together. Who decided that? When a star explodes, it throws its material out, but its gravity pulls it back in and a new star's formed. Except there are neutrinos. Neutrinos are flying through all the time. They're passing through us all the time. They hardly interact with other matter, but they do interact. Just a tiny amount. And when scientists looked at it, they said, we don't understand how do planets get formed, because all of that matter should be brought back in by the gravity of the star, but the neutrinos push it out. They push out atoms of matter just enough. So when that star was reformed, such as our sun, enough of that matter is pushed away to form planets so that life could exist. If that exact relationship between the neutrino and the rest of matter didn't exist exactly where it is, it would either push matter out too far and the star wouldn't reform, or it wouldn't push it out far enough and there would be no planets. Who decided on that balance? I think it's divine grace that seeks out, that wants life to develop and go on. I want to tell you about a few things that happened to me. Stephen said I should mention it. We all know, of course, that I'm highly talented and wonderful. Right? We start out there. But these things are way beyond what happens because of my talents. Several years ago, I had an assistant who was from India. And she said, why can't we do things with India? So I said, fine, look for some grants to do that. And she wasn't able to find any, but she did find one to do international work, and so we applied for it. They chose 20 organizations across the United States, and we were not one of them. An independent living center out of San Jose was chosen. And then, right before that was to happen, their executive director, who told me she hadn't really been looking for other jobs, suddenly had the opportunity to take another job. And she took that job. They had nobody else who could do it, so we were chosen instead. Resulting in 2 fantastic trips I took to South Korea to not only have a wonderful time, but to interact in a way where I'm helping them help people with disabilities on the other side of the world. The second trip, Jean went with me. I told her, you're going to kind of be on your own and you may not get to do a lot because I'm going to have to work all the time. But instead, I gave 3 talks, and one of the people there who we worked with spent his time taking us all over South Korea, giving us one of the most wonderful tours we could have ever had. And then, in about 2005, 2006, Dubai passed some laws for people with disabilities, and they started working on putting together their plan. Of course, at that period of time, I hadn't done any international work, and if they had been looking for somebody in independent living at that time, I wouldn't have been chosen. But last year, after they had been working on this for 8 years or so, one of their people said, we should add independent living in to our services, our ideas. And she knew somebody in Washington, D.C., and she contacted them and said, who in independent living has international experience? Well, this